Yep, very, oh, there we go. And actually there's someone who needs admitted. Just bringing somebody else in. Great. All right, yeah, so the first speaker is going to be Corey McKibben from McMaster University, and then we'll hear from Rashad Rahman and Lydia Clark-Rahman as well. It's going to be a great session, and I think that we should just hop right in. So Corey, if you're ready to speak, and as Court said, I'll just sort of be keeping time loosely and just make sure that we're making sure everybody has a fair amount of time to speak. So Corey.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, and we already tested this. So let's see if it wants to cooperate. And then, okay. And you guys cannot see my presenter notes. You can just see the slideshow.
Correct.
I have a video of you.
I can see your presentation, right?
Okay, that's good. So good afternoon, and thank you for coming to my talk. So today I will be presenting my paper, Decolonizing Canadian Water Governance, Lessons from Indigenous Case Studies. So this paper arose out of a practicum experience that I participated in through the Waters Without Borders program at McMaster University. So this is just a brief outline of my talk. So to begin, I will give a general overview of some of the problems within water governance in Canadian contexts. Although I assume that the lessons that I provide at the end can be applied elsewhere. And secondly, I will offer a brief introduction to the OECD principles on water governance. So the OECD principles on water governance were created to identify and help governments at all levels bridge critical governance gaps in the design and implementation of their water policies. I will then provide an Indigenous research methodology that the OECD can incorporate within their water governance framework to include sort of more nuanced ways of understanding water and human relationships with water. Thirdly, I will explain 3 problematic case studies in Canada that involve Indigenous populations in relation to water. And fourthly, after hearing the case studies, I will further problematize the OECD principles and offer a call to action to shift global water policy so that it includes different ways of knowing. So meaningful lessons about decolonizing water infrastructure, whether social, economic, or political, can be learned if we scrutinize existing governance principles, such as the ones provided by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the OECD, principles on water governance. So instead of using only Western frameworks to think about policy within Indigenous spheres of water, sanitation and hygiene, or WASH, the government of Canada can look to Indigenous ways of knowing to complement their understanding of how to govern these areas of WASH efficiently. So for the purposes of this presentation, the term Indigenous encompasses First Nation, Inuit, and Métis populations. These are the 3 sort of main Indigenous groups in Canada. So while Indigenous communities in Canada make up approximately 4.3% of the overall population, they unfortunately face a large proportion of the water crises in Canada. So according to the Auditor General of Canada, 1 in 5 Indigenous communities are under water advisories. And this means that the water is not safe for use. And additionally, more than half of the water systems in the lands reserved for Indigenous people pose a medium or high risk. And this has resulted in Canada's Indigenous land reserves to be compared to low to middle income countries. So I claim that the problems within water governance in Indigenous spheres are of colonialization. So Rosie Sims and colleagues point out that existing issues in WASH are systemic and due to supposed provincial and federal government ownership over all water in Canada. So the federal and provincial governments laying claim to water trivializes the ethic of responsibility that many Indigenous populations adhere to when interacting with water. So Deborah McGregor argues that the major strength of First Nations involvement and input in water governance is the consideration of values, ethics, and knowledge that provide a holistic understanding of water. And a similar statement is issued by Sims and colleagues who write that many Indigenous communities view water as something that is spiritual, medical, and the lifeblood of the land. So rather than reframe existing water governance principles using Western methodologies in areas of WASH, I argue that there must be equal participation of Indigenous expertise and ways of knowing so that altered principles can be adhered to by all transparently. So this presentation aims to critique 2 of the 12 OECD principles on water governance, which the Government of Canada supports, in order to promote decolonization within Canadian water governance. So instituted in 2009 by the OECD, which is again, a multinational governmental organization dedicated to economic policy, the OECD principles on water governance were created to identify and help governments at all levels bridge critical governance gaps in the design and implementation of their water policies. So the OECD principles focus on the economic analysis and best practices of governing water in various countries, and utilizing language that is antithetical to Indigenous ways of perceiving and acting with water. So the OECD's consideration of territorial development positions water management not as an environmental issue, but one of economics. And it's important to note that the OECD principles on water governance stand on 3 pillars. The first is effectiveness, which is a straightforward pillar that asks whether the principles on water governance are effective or not in a government's strategic layout of water policy. The second is efficiency. So this pillar states that an efficient water plan comes to the least cost for a society. However, when there are 2 opposing ideals at play, such as water as an economic resource and water as lifeblood, it is hard to consider who is supposed to endure the least costs. And if both societies are to share equal costs, it is unclear from the principles how that is supposed to happen. And the third pillar is trust and engagement. So the governments that employ the OECD principles, including Canada, must build confidence and be inclusive with stakeholders. So governments must act with integrity while monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting water governance when needed. So one way to achieve the goals of the OECD pillars is to include alternative ways of knowing in the conversations that shape policy. And later, I will examine how the Indigenous research methodology of 2-wide seeing can help evaluate at least 2 of the 12 OECD principles. So specifically, I will look at principles 4 and 9. Principle 4 says that a government must adapt the level of capacity of responsible authorities to the complexity of water challenges to be met and to the set of competencies required to carry out their duties. And principle 9 says a government must mainstream integrity and transparency practices across water policies, water institutions, and water governance frameworks for greater accountability and trust in decision-making. So I contend that principles 4 and 9 are the most urgent to be critiqued. As will be shown below in the case studies that are examined, there are serious gaps in trust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And there's also a lack of understanding regarding the complexities surrounding areas of WASH in Indigenous communities that provincial governments have yet to address efficiently. So to mitigate the lack of understanding about Indigenous water issues in areas of governance and to foster trust between settler and Indigenous communities, it is prudent that governments utilize the Indigenous methodology of 2-wide seeing. So two-wide seeing was conceptualized by Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall. So two-wide seeing is a model of knowledge that promotes the utilization of both Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. So corroborated by McGregor, Andrea Reed and colleagues state that central to two-wide seeing is an idea of netukulum, or an ethic of responsibility. So water scholars, practitioners, and policymakers must pay attention to the potential harms of current practices and policies and how they can possibly impact future generations. And so within two-wide seeing, there are two principles that are adhered to. The first is learn from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. And the second is from the other eye with the strength of Western knowledges and ways of knowing. So as noted by Reed and colleagues, it is not a question of whether two-wide seeing can be utilized in areas of WASH. It is a question of how governments can transform and shape their policies to recognize Indigenous methodologies as legitimate. So in other words, how can we apply Indigenous two-wide seeing to Canadian water governance practices? And the next section will address this by examining 3 case studies. So here I will briefly refer to 3 case studies taken from existing literature that explain opportunities to fill water policy gaps within various levels of Indigenous organization across Canada. Once these case studies have been explained, it will be made clear how water governance in Canada can move toward decolonization. So the first is key developments in Canadian policy and legislation with respect to First Nations drinking water quality from 2003 to 2013. So in 2003, the government of Canada announced that it would create a First Nations water strategy. The strategy would aim to utilize resources that could improve the safety of water supplies in First Nations communities. By 2008, it was evident that the strategy failed, and there were many issues that still needed to be solved. In 2010, the Government of Canada passed Bill-531, titled An Act Respecting the Safety of Drinking Water, and this bill was also rejected by the Chiefs of Ontario. And then there was a revision to Bill 5-8, there was a Bill 5-8, which is a revision of Bill 5-31, and this claimed that the federal government would not abrogate or derogate from any existing Aboriginal or treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, which respects Indigenous autonomy, supposedly, except to the extent necessary to ensure the safety of drinking water on First Nations land. In June of 2013, the federal government brought forward the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. The act suggests that all water, whether on Indigenous or non-Indigenous land, should be of equal quality. So the Chiefs of Ontario noted that there are problems with the act insofar that the federal government did not provide sufficient funding for water infrastructure to First Nations communities, and that there are potential concerns about treaty rights being ignored. So the second case study is Chiefs of Ontario 2008 Water Declaration of the Anishinaabeg, Mushkegowuk, and Onkanay-Onwe populations. So in 2001, the Chiefs of Ontario, frustrated by the lack of governance with the Great Lakes, sought to change existing policy. The Chiefs of Ontario attacked policy at 3 different levels. So the international level with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. This is between Canada and the USA. At the national level with the Canada-Ontario Agreement respecting the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And thirdly, the provincial, which was the Great Lakes Strategy and Great Lakes Protection Act. So in 2008, after years of deliberation amongst Indigenous elders, the Chiefs of Ontario presented the Water Declaration of the Anishinaabeg, Mushkegowuk, and Onkanay-Onwe. The declaration, which emphasizes Indigenous ways of knowing, resulted in recognition of traditional knowledge in the Great Lakes Protection Act 2015. Further, the Chiefs of Ontario created the Great Lakes Guardian Council, a group of traditional knowledge holders who inform Great Lake policy in both Canada and the United States. Heightened success came in 2017 when the Government of Canada dedicated funding to create a Great Lakes Indigenous Fund, an initiative to support Indigenous community-based knowledge practices to help protect the Great Lakes. And finally, the third case study is the community of Black Tickle in Newfoundland. The community of Black Tickle, Newfoundland is an Indigenous land reserve created by the government of Newfoundland as part of their plan to centralize and resettle Indigenous communities. Without robust water infrastructure, such as pipes and clean drinking water, the community relies on a portable water dispensing unit. So the cost of the portable water dispensing unit is about $2 per liter, which makes it inaccessible to many low income community members. So distrust of the portable water dispensing unit rose in the community due to its proximity to a cherished brook and the lack of funds provided by the government to sustain it. The poor placement of the portable water dispensing unit means that residents often have to travel by vehicle to reach their water resource. And this minimizes accessibility for people who cannot walk long distances of 1 to 2 kilometers. Many of the residents in Black Tickle have turned to making their own water wells instead of using the portable water dispensing unit. However, these wells often become contaminated with animal waste or buried in large snowfalls. So the failure to address water policy concerns created immeasurable negative public health outcomes. So in 2014, after a request to the government of Newfoundland to fix the water infrastructure issues, residents were told that they needed to put forward 30% of the overall costs, and the province would put forward 70%. So the province's 70-30% cost split was inconceivable for the residents, as many are of lower socioeconomic status and barely able to afford the water in the portable water dispensing unit in the first place. And much to the upset of the Black Tickle residents, the citizens of Pigeon Cove, a nearby non-Indigenous community, received $100,000 in funding when it was found out that their water pipes were contaminated during a similar time period. So appreciating these three case studies, an analysis can be done to provide a call to action to decolonize water. So Yates and colleagues note that in Canada, Indigenous elders felt current government initiatives around water to be limited and short-sighted. When we consider water, one must consider all that water supports and all that supports water. So instrumental to my paper has been an ethic of responsibility and recognition. So in the aforementioned case studies, there were a few instances where Indigenous peoples achieved respect or recognition in water governance. Instances of secured respect for Indigenous communities came after self-advocation and preservation from elders. So if we ought to understand Indigenous communities as having a right to autonomous action and recognition, then it is necessary to embrace their perspectives. To explain how Indigenous perspectives could enhance water policy, I will critique OECD Principles 9 and 4 using the above case studies. So first I'll start off with Principle 9. Residents of Black Tickle suffered after attempting to advocate for their survival, lacking funds to meet the province of Newfoundland's demands. So according to the Unamaki Institute of Natural Resources, Natukulimk, which is the ethic of responsibility, is achieving adequate standards of community nutrition and economic well-being without jeopardizing the integrity, diversity, or productivity of our environment. So the government of Newfoundland, splitting the cost of repairing water infrastructure, denied the community of Black Tickle an ethic of responsibility. So Newfoundland increased the tension that exists between settlers and the oppressed by providing a non-Indigenous community $100,000. Black Tickle residents, resorting to creating wells in the ground, harmed community nutrition and economic well-being. the community of Black Tickle showcases a fundamental flaw in Principle 9 of the OECD. Excuse me. The government of Newfoundland, maintaining a division of respect between how it treats Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, has shown a lack of trust in decision-making. The case studies in 2.1 and 2.3 show that there is a prominent distrust insofar that the Chiefs of Ontario believe the government of Canada lacks the foresight to adhere to treaty rights. And shortage of trust is prominent in the Black Tickle case insofar that the province of Newfoundland built a portable water dispensing unit near a water resource that is cherished by the community. So ignoring sociocultural inferences from the community that you are working with, such as learning what the community views as important with respect to their cultural values, is in direct violation of an ethic of responsibility and respect. Learning what the community values when making water policy would be supported by the pillars of the OECD, which foster trust and engagement. So now I'll talk about Principle 4. So it's not obvious that non-Indigenous government authorities have the capacity to meet complex water governance challenges in Indigenous spheres. So to meet the goals of Principle 4, a government must be able to work with all of its members. For example, case study 2.1 shows the incompetence of the Canadian government to create a bill that satisfies the needs of Indigenous communities. In case study 2.2, Indigenous communities had to advocate for themselves, preserving their own autonomy to create adequate governance groups in the Great Lakes area. And often this kind of advocacy is to the detriment of Indigenous communities, as the groups that are formed have to take funding from non-Indigenous sources. So even in areas of self-advocacy, the oppressors have influence over how the oppressed maintain funding. So within governance spheres where Indigenous ways of knowing are prevalent, it could be the case that Western systems infiltrate the direction of a project to maintain funded support. So specific concerns that ought to be taken into consideration in the future are whether or not the Canadian government will try to steer Indigenous programs within WASH. And referring back to Yates and colleagues' sentiment, all who are supported by water in Canada are not being supported, especially in a way that is competent, transparent, or with integrity. So a challenge that remains in Canadian WASH context is considering Indigenous voices as equal in governance. To open up possibilities for mitigating the above issues, research methodologies such as two-wide saying must be given equal weight in shaping policy. Federal and provincial governments need to look to pass treaty agreements and reformulate WASH principles with Indigenous perspectives, giving Indigenous communities respect and recognition. So C24 Chair Ambassador Keisha McGuire proclaimed in February of 2021 that this year we entered the first year of the 4th international decade for the eradication of colonialism. I call on member states to renew their commitment to strive to make this the last decade to be observed, end quote. I have presented this paper as a step out of many toward decolonizing water governance in Canada. I hope to have shown with this presentation that it is necessary to make space for other voices in water governance. In order to show that, I provided 3 different case studies that relate various studies of Indigenous organization, advocating for their voices to be heard. Finally, I provided a brief analysis that assessed the dangers of 2 OECD principles of water governance that the Canadian government recognizes as legitimate. By highlighting the dangers in the case studies, 3 lessons are apparent. First, there needs to be an addition of Indigenous two-wide saying in water governance. Secondly, Canada must strengthen its nation-to-nation praxis with Indigenous communities. And thirdly, there needs to be a creation of space in WASH that fosters Indigenous voices so that there can be equal participation in policy conversations to mitigate existing problems and explore new possibilities. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I will gladly take any questions. Sorry.
So because there's 9 people, I think that we can probably just hop in so long as we're conscious about speaking over other people. But Rashad, it seems like you had a question.
I actually do have a question, but I meant to just give you the clapping hands, but it also put up the, yeah. But yeah, I don't mind. Sure. So thank you so much, Corey. This is excellent. You've given, I think, both Lydia and I a lot to think about for our talk as well. I just had a couple of questions. So I've bumped up against this a couple of times, and just for clarification, so with the two-eyed seeing, you had mentioned these 2 phrases in points 1 and 2, indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and then Western knowledges and ways of knowing. And I suppose in some sense, this also, this is related to my worry sometimes about the concept of colonialism in general, but I'm just not sure what it is that these 2 specific ideas refer to specifically. So it seems like you have a specific concept of the West in mind and a specific concept of indigenous in mind. And there's like a reasonable contrast to be made between the 2. So I can understand what it might mean to say like Western values, interests, beliefs, and so forth, and indigenous values, interests, and beliefs, and so forth. But putting it in the phrase of like, indigenous knowledge or Western knowledges, it gives each of them a specific kind of legitimacy that I wonder if it's really required to make that strong of a claim. So I'm just wondering if maybe you could just clarify this up for me. That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and something that I've been thinking about a lot lately as well, because I'm doing a constitutional law course right now in my department. So figuring out how these 2 ideas are distinct is really important in framing constitutions. So I think in terms of knowledge, it just comes down to how indigenous people view and understand the world, because a lot of the ways that they conceptualize nature and spirituality predate sort of Western concepts. And so you would want to say like, this is how a specific indigenous community interacts with water, because obviously not all indigenous communities interact with water. And so they have specific ontologies of water as lifeblood, water as spirituality. There are some indigenous communities in BC that specifically go to the water to make political decision making. And so, but these can also incorporate like Western ideas. So like in Western knowledge, I would say that those more conform to the OECD kind of things in terms of like economic analysis of water as a resource. We understand water as H2O, something that can be like understood in more scientific terms. And it's sort of, the indigenous people would say it loses that spiritual connection and that earth connection. And so that's why I think that a lot of the times indigenous researchers might say that these are 2 distinct, but overlapping, because you don't want to say they're completely separated. And that's sort of the idea with two-eyed seeing, is that we recognize that there are different ways of viewing water, but they're not so mutually exclusive that they have to be completely like separate. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that helps a great deal. Thanks, Corey.
Oh, no worries.
Danny, you have a question as well?
Yeah, thank you, Corey. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background so that you understand the question. I did a presentation this morning on rivers and the Latin American conception of some indigenous and Black communities in Latin America about rivers and water. And so I don't do water governance necessarily, but it's a topic that is related. And so you presented at the beginning, you presented the conflict as, so the Canadian government seems to see the problem as economic, but the indigenous community seems to see the problem as environmental. You mentioned it at the end of the last question, but it seems that all the identity problem with water is not included in your reconstruction, at least in the presentation. So I think part of the debates about water has to do with the identity and the ways in which non-Western societies live their identity depends on water and rivers and the relationship with them. So I wanted you to explore a little bit more, and maybe this other question is related to that. What if the two eyes see different things? So it is easy if water is only a problem of accessibility, but if it is a problem of cultural identity, and cultural identity with shocking visions of what water is, then that's a big problem. So just a simple example, at some point in the Colombian Constitutional Court had this big debate because we Westerners see oil as a natural resource that should be exploited. And some Colombian indigenous communities see oil as the blood of earth. And you don't take the blood of people out. So they strongly oppose to it. So it's two eyes, but they are not seeing the same object. So how do you expect they to agree when they are not? That's not compatible. Even if you respect the other vision, the other vision is not seeing what you see. I don't know if it is clear.
Yeah, so in terms of your first question, that's a really point question. It was really interesting, and it's something that I want to explore more as I do this research. So I wrote this paper over like a 2-month period for practicum experience, and so I didn't really go into as much depth as I could have in terms of like going into the sort of nitty-gritty of how to reconcile tensions between Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. Something that I might posit as a rejoinder is that within Indigenous thought processes, there's this idea of natukulink, which is an ethic of responsibility. So in the case of seeing oil as like Earth's blood or oil as an exploitative resource, when framing policy literature, advocates might want to say, well, there could be this idea of responsibility that treats oil as something that should be respected. And there have been a lot of case studies of people saying like, well, this should involve advocates making community toolboxes, such as like cultural competency and things like that for workers who go into these areas and try to mine or extract oil. I'm not sure whether these tools are actually effective, and it puts a lot of the onus on advocates to do a lot of that policy reframing. And it's not clear whether the government will actually follow those policies. And so this is an area of research that would have to be sort of, I think, explored more to see whether these things can be truly effective. But that's what I would suggest, is like incorporating these ideas of respect that Indigenous communities adhere to and talk about within their own research institutions, and try to put those at the government level.
So sorry, I will just follow up, and I won't bother you anymore. So sure, this is like my presentation, which was incomplete because we are doing this researching and whatever, but I think your research will be really enriched if you start integrating Indigenous views on water, not only accessibility. That will be, yeah, and that will show you the complexity of the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, also, there is a problem of accessibility that I'm not denying that, but the other one is cultural identity. So anyways, that was just an invitation and not a criticism.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that like, there's even issues of constitutional frameworks. So like my department is like known for its constitutional law. And so like, there's a lot of ways in which the Constitution disenfranchises even Indigenous policy even being adhered to, because a lot of policy allows like the Canadian government to supersede Indigenous rulings. And so even getting Indigenous views within governmental spheres, it's really hard for Indigenous advocates. Like we just had our first Indigenous Truth and Reconciliation Day this year. And some would even say that that is an act as a result of a whole bunch of Indigenous things coming up recently. And so even getting recognition for Indigenous stuff is a good first step in creating these policies. Sorry, yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Great. So Corey, I think we are going to have to move on to the second presentation unless anybody has any pressing questions. No? Okay. Well, then we will be passing it over to the next presenters, Rashad Rahman and Lydia Clark-Rahman from the University of Toronto, if you want to take it away.
Thank you.
So I know that I've talked. Yeah, I've talked. So I know my audio sounds fine. Lydia, how's your audio?
It's good. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much. Yeah, Corey, this is just fantastic. I think this just really suits. This is just a nice group to be in. I'm going to set the timer just to make sure that Lydia and I don't go over. So I'll set it for maximum at kind of the 25 mark. I think that's what it said. So yeah, hi everyone. So our talk for today is The Moral Responsibility of Whom? Rethinking Water Inequality in Indigenous Communities in Canada. So this is a co-authored presentation. It's co-authored work. So I'm Rashad. I'm a PhD student, doctoral student in the Department of Philosophy in the Joint Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. I specialize in intersex pediatric surgery, so pediatric bioethics, a very specific kind of area. And Lydia and I are teaming up today and using our specialties in bioethics and public health to contribute to this really important issue. So I'll leave it to Lydia to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Lydia Raymond. I am a Master of Public Health student at the Dalalana School of Public Health within the University of Toronto.
All right, so today's talk is going to be in two parts. So in the first part, Lydia is going to go through what water inequity or inequality means in Canada. And we're not going to make a big deal in the talk about the difference between equality and equity. We're simply going to just talk about the issue from the perspective of just safe and accessible drinking water, and whether you characterize this as an issue of equity or equality is something we're going to leave aside. She'll then deconstruct some policy and think about some of the proposed solutions within the Canadian context, and then talk about the health implications of unsafe water and why that's deeply problematic from a moral and public health perspective. Then we're going to shift gears into my portion of the talk, in which I'll do some bioethics review and provide a bit of a moral framework or moral contributions to the water crisis in Canada, and then some takeaways of the talk, and then hopefully we've got some time for questions.
Okay, perfect. So we'll get started. So about 39% of First Nations communities are at high risk for water contaminations with boil water advisories in place. So currently there are 44 long-term advisories in 32 communities. There's 24 water advisories in Ontario and about 4 in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. There are also 29 short-term water advisories in place. So we'll talk a little bit about the 3 types of advisories that get issued and why they're issued. So first, water advisories get issued because of water line breaks, equipment failure, poor filtration or disinfection of the water treatments, not having enough trained people to maintain or test the water systems. So basically there's 3 kinds of advisories that can get issued. So the first one being boil water advisories. These are issued when there are viruses, bacteria, and parasites present in the water, or when there's low chlorine levels. The water must be boiled for at least a minute to use or consume. And they don't recommend that children or elderly people use it. And are suggested to be given sponge baths with assistant to avoid consumption. The second kind of advisory is a do not consume advisory. This is issued when the water system has contaminants like lead and it can't be taken out of the water by boiling, and obviously should not be consumed or used to bathe. And then there are do not use advisories. In this advisory, the water shouldn't be used in any capacity because of the major health risks that it imposes. So about 50% of the advisories that are in place right now have been in place for at least a decade. In 2015, Canada promised to end all of the water advisories by March 2021 this year. Obviously, they didn't meet that goal. But since making the promise in 2015, there have been about 109 water advisories lifted, which is great, but people still continue to suffer, so not so great. And in the long-term advisories, we only see boil water advisories, and in the short term, we see do not consume and do not use. Okay, so why are First Nations communities still subject to unsafe water? Well, these reasons are actually highlighted in the 2021 Auditor General Report that was published this year. It's because of outdated policy, underfunding for water infrastructure and maintenance and operations. They found in the report that the way funding is calculated for communities and building this water infrastructure is based on a formula that's been used for the last 30 years. There's an overall lack of maintenance and infrastructure of the water systems, and there's no regulatory frameworks in place that properly regulate or enforce. So, and we'll talk a little bit about colonialism too and its impact. So Canada is a leading reservoir for storing 1/5 of the world's fresh water supply. We obviously have enough water to supply every single Canadian here, but yet Indigenous communities are faced with this clear water inequity. So in terms of colonialism, it's really no doubt that Canada has had this long ongoing colonial relationship with Indigenous peoples. There have been broken promises and structural mistreatment. I take the position that colonialism and historical injustice is the driving force behind these issues. The water issue isn't just a mere issue of water itself. It's a public health, it's environmental, it's a political issue. And we're looking at policy. Policy has really restricted Indigenous peoples in terms of their culture, social practices, and overall mobility on the land. With the establishment of the 1876 First Indian Act, First Nations members and their reserve lands are considered the responsibility of the federal government. In 1930 came a new act called the Natural Resource Transfer Act, which basically transferred the administrative responsibility for lands and resources to the provinces in Canada, which really left gaps in the frameworks and room for there to be provincial interest and delegations of authority over resources and land, in which really superseded Indigenous rights to resources and how resources are used and the maintenance of that. So the administrative levels of government have historically controlled, the way resources are developed and used on the land, and lands that are reserved for Indigenous people specifically. And oftentimes, there's a lack of participation, there's a lack of input and consultation in decision-making processes. That's been one of the bigger issues. And I think it's even important to note, if we look at, how the government does their environmental risk assessments, officials go into community, they assess the environmental risks, that water issue, this water problem has health implications for. They don't really consider the social and cultural connections or interactions to how communities really use resources, and I think moving forward, there needs to be a respect and integration of Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in research, and not just asserting what's in the best interest of, science or the way science is conducted here, to really care for the health of people and the health of our environment. So I think it just also really questions this idea of, is fixing policy the answer to everything? When and will there be a complete kind of long-term solution that is in place that really supports Indigenous peoples in self-determination and sovereignty? Okay, briefly, I will just go through some of the data. So to build on context of our presentation, the data that we've analyzed has been from systematic literature review findings, and a large portion of this data actually just comes right from the Canadian government websites on Stats Canada. So their website shares the information for each nation that is currently under water advisories. This includes the population of the community, type of advisory that are in effect, the date the advisory went into effect, the status or where they are in the project of creating this water infrastructure. So basically there's 5 stages to water infrastructure and, building it on the lands. So there's 5 stages. So that being feasibility, design, construction, construction complete, and lift. And on average, amongst the 24 communities in Ontario, about half of the communities are at the construction stage of, building these water infrastructures in the community. There's 24 communities affected in Ontario, the average population being about 740 people living on reserve. The average year the advisories have been in effect for was since 2011. Nesktanga community has had their boil water advisory in effect since 1995, so they have not had proper, access to clean drinking water since, 26 years. On average, the homes affected by this water inequity is about 160. And this again is amongst the 24 communities, 8 community buildings, and this includes nursing stations and educational centers. And then, yeah, so these stats I think are just only significant in the sense that they help provide a clear context of assessing the degree of health implications and risks that this water problem has, and to further kind of assess the efficacy of the current and future actions, and ultimately keeping with this theme of the conference of creating pathways to peace and justice. How do we reconcile meaningful relationships with these communities when disparities like this exist? And, I also just like to note that, although we can look at all these average numbers, I think, I would take the position that one affected in a community would directly or indirectly affect all. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the legislation that exists currently. So in 2015, as I mentioned, Canada made the promise to end all of the water advisories by March. In late 2020 last year, they made like a formal statement saying that we're not going to meet this goal. However, they're still in line to support the 2030 UN Sustainable Goal 6, which is to ensure the availability and sustainable management of water. There is the 2013 Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. So this act basically focuses on 11 central regulatory components. It acts as a way for Canada and First Nations to develop regulation to ensure access to safe, clean, and reliable drinking water, effective treatment of the wastewater, and protection of the water. However, there are some issues with it. It provides weak protection to Indigenous peoples and their treaty rights. It's unfunded legislation. It's non-enforceable. It carries really more burdens than resources because of these gaps that I'm talking about in the frameworks between the provincial, municipal, and federal government. There's all this room for these responsibilities to be shifted, which is an issue. While truth and reconciliation is not a formal piece of legislation, Canada has made the commitment to move towards a more respectful and healthy relationships towards Indigenous peoples and meaningful consultation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And, they're committed to recognizing and addressing the broader, issues of water, sanitation, poverty, housing. And then access to water and sanitation are recognized by the United Nations as human rights, reflecting the fundamental nature of these basics in every person's life. Lack of access to safe, sufficient, and affordable water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities has a devastating effect on the health, dignity, prosperity of billions of people, and has significant consequences for the realization of other human rights. And then one last thing I just wanted to briefly talk about, although it's not, a piece of legislation that Canada signed into, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is basically this instrument that was adopted by the United Nations. And it builds on the rights that constitute the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Canada is one of, I think, 4 countries not to sign on to acknowledge this international treaty. Okay, and then lastly, we'll just talk a little bit the health implications of the water. So health disparities and social inequality are the direct result of colonialism, and on a historical and contemporary level, The number of waterborne infections in First Nations communities are about 26 times higher than the Canadian national average. Contaminated water leads to incidence and prevalence of skin issues, respiratory infections, hygiene diseases, and overall just a higher transmissibility of infectious disease. 1/3 of the residents use cisterns or personal wells to collect water, and many reserves are in very remote locations. And because there is a large demand for tanked water trucks to come and fill the cisterns, there's often a lack of the truck maintenance, the disinfection, which ultimately leads to further contamination. They found cracked and broken cistern tanks that freeze in the winter, have resulted in contaminants like rodents, snakes, and organic material. They're very costly to operate, and oftentimes there's limited access to healthcare and higher rates of pre-existing health conditions on top of unsafe water. And I think lastly, the last health implication we can consider is the mental illness and psychological distress. Because of this prevalence and illness in communities, people would be afraid to use this basic human necessity. And now I will turn it to Rashad.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Lyd. That's great. All right. So in this half of the presentation, we're going to take essentially the information that Lyd has helped us with in terms of like the history and the statistics and the sort of pertinent information for understanding the issue at all with respect to Indigenous water inequality, and now put it in a more sort of broad ethical or bioethical framework. And so what it is that I want to do here is I want to provide some considerations to further understand and argue for Indigenous water equality. And in part, mainly by putting some of these issues in distinctively moral-laden language for the very purpose of furthering this case for Indigenous water equality. So the first is breaking down the moral dimension specifically. So there's a question of moral responsibility. Whose moral responsibility is this to solve? There's a question of moral accountability. Who do we hold accountable for solving this problem specifically? And then applied to our issue at hand, the idea has traditionally been that the Canadian government has been the target of moral responsibility, is accountable for their promises, and has a responsibility to maintain honesty regarding timelines and prospects of their proposed solutions. I'm quite right. And the question that we ask here is, has the traditional, unilateral, and univariable appeal to Canadian governmental irresponsibility and perpetuation of colonialism been a sufficiently plausible response to the Indigenous water inequality crisis? Does it address the moral dimension comprehensively? Next slide. So what we have in mind here is, well, again, so we're going to keep this as the question at hand, and we're going to just use some considerations first. So some things to consider are there's a moral right to safe and accessible drinking water in addition to the sort of UN legal right to, or proclamation of a legal right to safe and accessible water. And these rights should aim for various kinds of properties, one of which is universality. It should be to all persons, impartiality, so no partiality considerations arise here. And they should be unconditional. So even if certain kinds of rights are forfeited, for example, your right to freedom, say when you're incarcerated, nevertheless, there is this fundamental right to safe and clean drinking water. And the conditions on which reconciliation is made possible should be forefront. So things like forgiveness, trust, justice, and so forth. As Lydia pointed out, it's not just a question of policy, but it's really respecting what this term, reconciliation, means. And relatedly, on a more methodological note, the method by which reconciliation is achieved should not be inconsistent with what reconciliation means to Indigenous persons. And that's a sort of crucial element to this question. And so what we're trying to think of here is, should we sort of question or further the narrative? And we're doing a little bit of both here. Next slide. And so breaking it down, it's absolutely a perfectly well and good explanation to say that, well, the Canadian government has governmental and moral responsibilities to Indigenous communities with this problem. And so, as we've already talked about a little bit, there's this question of accountability. And thankfully, the Canadian government has been held accountable for a lot of these issues. There's a question here of transparencies. So now, for example, you can look up very clearly, this is a bit of an unprecedented time where if you wanted to look up what the Canadian government is up to in certain communities, you actually can, and you can see their progress on some of these issues, and they're tracked and monitored, and it's a form of accountability as well. There's a notion here of restoration. So past harms are identified, admitted on, and worked on moving forward. Recommendations are also part of the Canadian governmental moral responsibilities. Building relations means ethical research and restorative practices and so forth. And moving forward, there's a question here of, well, what are some of the drawbacks and ways forward for advancing this case for Indigenous water equality, right? And what is it that's holding us back in many ways? Next slide. And so some things that we might want to sort of know here is, I mean, there are certain things that certainly are to be avoided, especially in the context of procuring Indigenous water equality. One would be like what we might call cancel culture tactics, on which the Canadian government is unilaterally blamed for Indigenous water equality. Taking this Indigenous call to action really seriously. In many cases, the Canadian government, of course, is morally responsible for some of the sort of some of the issues arising from Indigenous water inequality. But there's a question here of whether the most effective way to sort of promote this responsibility is to sort of cancel governmental authorities and legislation, for example, solely for the purpose of bringing about reconciliation. This seems inconsistent with what the Indigenous call to reconciliation means. There's a question here of virtue signaling, right? So again, we're not making a statement here on the sort of whether land acknowledgements are good or bad. I mean, they certainly have their role. But when they don't become more than acknowledgements, so in other words, no matter what side of the sort of camp you sit on, when land acknowledgements don't become more than mere acknowledgements, then we run into a question of, well, what is this doing for Indigenous communities specifically, and how is it building better relations in a way that's really practically efficacious? And then finally, the oversimplification of certain kinds of narratives. So for example, the legacy of colonialism being the root of all evil in the Indigenous context. So even though it's true, it's certainly true, there are problematic aspects to colonialism, and some decolonial practices, of course, are recommended. We need to take things case by case so as to understand to what extent colonialism really does have sort of anything to do with certain aspects of Indigenous water inequality. And then things to be encouraged, right? So of course, here's what to be avoided and here's what's to be encouraged. So recognition of the progress made via the Truth and Reconciliation Act regarding steps to water equality. That includes other legislation as well. And it also includes Canada being held in general morally responsible for some of the darker parts of its past. Indigenous informed decision-making in the context of policy with explicit goals regarding water procurement. And I have in mind, for example, non-domination of Indigenous persons when researching. I think Lydia gave an example of this earlier in the talk. Next slide. Now, further moral contributors to actively solving water inequality, really putting some meat on the bones here to what it is that we can do, sort of morally speaking. So there's certainly a place for addressing and rectifying broken promises. Broken promises have implications intergenerationally. And a case in point, for example, is Indigenous persons' relations to Western medical care. Clear problems here, and relatedly, fostering trust-based relationships are crucial to a Canada that has both, distinctively Western and Indigenous aspects. Full transparency regarding contingencies and uncertainties to mitigate moral harms or injury. So what I have in mind here, for example, is the more transparent the Canadian government is with respect to things like the extent to which COVID impacts their ability to supply water for Indigenous persons should be made really, really clear so as to not give the impression that this Indigenous issue is being sort of put under the radar. So moral transparency here actually really does play a role in building these trust-based relationships. And then something that, both Lydia and I have been thinking about a bit have been things like non-governmental moral responsibilities. So we have in mind, for example, Canadian citizens being more aware of these problems that exist within Indigenous communities. So a lot of Canadian citizens, for example, are non-culpably ignorant of these issues, right? They simply don't know that they exist and they have no means to. And of course, that's a real problem of the need for more education. Many water-based companies, including ones which privatize water, should consider these problems as issues of distributive justice, right? So not putting it in colonial terms, but putting it in terms of like, look, if you bear, for example, relational proximity to an Indigenous land, relational proximity does have implications for having certain kinds of moral responsibilities in the same way that you sometimes have more responsibilities to your neighbor than you do, say, to a few streets down from you. And so putting it in the terms of distributive justice might actually be a nice kind of motivation for taking this issue seriously from a more business perspective. And then one thing that we've been considering as well is relational proximity of just merely Canadian citizens to Indigenous lands should play a role in Canadian citizens' moral responsibility theorizing. And of course, what we have in mind here is something like taking really seriously the idea that, in virtue of existing on or close to certain indigenous lands, it's really important to take that relational proximity really seriously, and it might actually bear certain kinds of moral responsibilities insofar as the good that can be achieved can sometimes be much more easy to make effective when someone is nearby or when a group is nearby. Yeah. Okay, next slide. And there's this really nice quote from Chuck Strahl, and this is what we'll end with. And it's Chuck Strahl is Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development in Canada, who I believe isn't now, but was. And I really like this quote. So governments like to write policy, and they like to write legislation, and they like to codify things and so on. And Aboriginal people want to talk about restoration, reconciliation, forgiveness, about healing, about truth. And those things are all things of the heart and of relationship and not of government policy. And so what we want to do in this talk is both address this issue from a structural, institutional, and historical perspective with full recognition of the public health harms that have been presented, but also with these considerations that look like if we're going to take this really seriously as a distinctively moral issue, we have to bring in these moral terms like reconciliation, forgiveness, healing, and so forth. And this really will be the way going forward for really doing something about Indigenous water inequality. So I'm going to give it to Lyd now to say some of the takeaways, and then we'll take your questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So some of the main takeaways from our presentation today is just that water inequality affects Indigenous communities at these disproportionate rates. This is a really great opportunity to really reflect upon the idea of the privileges of being a Canadian citizen, leadership roles and responsibilities, Indigenous research ethics, the broad moral dimensions of water inequality, and the responsibilities that non-Indigenous peoples play in the action and understandings of water inequality on this national and global scale. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.
All right.
On the screen here.
25 minutes on the dot. That's great. Lydia and I were a little worried that it was going to go over, so this is actually quite nice.
Yeah, it was very well done. It was a great presentation. And again, there's not that many of us, so if anybody just wants to jump in with questions, feel free.
Maybe I'll just also say, if that's okay, Dan, that you can leave the question open and both Lydia and I can take a stab at it. Or if you have like a specific question for either of us, that's totally okay too.
Danny?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was interesting the way in which you mixed it, what you call the recognition of the damage of the contaminated water to the Indigenous peoples, and so it was good. So you both mentioned, or Rush, I think, mentioned it seems to be two different concepts of reconciliation. I don't know how to call it. The Western society has a concept, and it seems that the Indigenous communities have another concept of reconciliation. This might be my ignorance in the topic, and it sounds like a title of a book, but what is the Indigenous people's concept of reconciliation? I want you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I don't know exactly what you.
I'm actually going to invite Lydia to go ahead and share her thoughts first.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So basically, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came from the broader discussions of the Indian residential schools, if you're familiar. Invited Indigenous peoples the opportunity to share their stories and experiences, and it posed kind of this their needs of what they think of in terms of reconciliation, and how we should go about it. I don't know, it's weird when we think about it, because from what Rashad was saying with that quote about reconciliation being meaningful, and Indigenous peoples have this different perspective of it, and then the government goes ahead and they kind of have this other perspective of it. I don't know, I kind of just think of research ethics, and what Corey was saying about two-eyed seeing, and how we have these two varying perspectives, and how do we bring those together meaningfully. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Report is a very large document, but I would be happy to share some resources on that if you're interested in learning more. But yeah, I don't know for
Yeah.
sure. Onto that.
Yeah, thanks, Lid.
Yeah, I would love to know a little bit more, because it seems that, I mean, it seems that that is really consistent and it's a really strong part of your argument, but you know, this is analytical philosophy on me. I want to see what the necessary and condition and sufficient conditions are for reconciliation for the indigenous peoples, which are different from our perspective, you know, because it's implied in your, and I am sure it's there. So sorry.
Yeah, no. So Danny, necessary and sufficient conditions for reconciliation is a perfectly legitimate enterprise. By the way, like that's fine.
I was kidding with that. I was kidding.
Oh, that's that's actually fine. You know, someone might say, well, that's like a distinctively non-Indigenous way of putting it, but that's fine. So I have one comment about this. And again, like Lydia has the resources. This is her area of specialty for sure. So one thing that I would just suggest is that, at least from what was being expressed from Strahl, from that quote we read, was that if what you take to mean by reconciliation from the Western perspective is merely governmental, then it's at least an insufficient account of reconciliation. So it's not that it's mistaken, the idea that reconciliation needs to have governmental impact, or it needs to be put in policy-laden terms, in the sense that like we create policies to reestablish a friendship. That's the original meaning of reconciliation. But that the qualities of true reconciliation, so it's not just the difference between two views, but the Indigenous view really does emphasize that reconciliation can't be just governmental. So one way of putting it is that a necessary condition for reconciliation would be structural or governmental rectifications. And then the sufficient condition would be this Indigenous point, that it needs a further element of trust, of healing, of truth, and so forth. Yeah. Okay, cool. If that helps, that's great.
Corey?
Thank you both for the really engaging talk. It was really interesting to see how the areas of water intersect with public health. I don't know if this is a question or merely just a comment, but I'm wondering if there might be tension with framing sort of the ethics component of the talk as a bioethical issue and not as an Indigenous ethics issue, merely because bioethics has a lot of contention in terms of foregoing like Western perspectives of what counts as autonomy in clinical settings or in like global health settings, or even just like self-determination is autonomy, but like all those sort of conceptions that Western people sort of take to be like the most important sort of things. Whereas, like I was saying, like Natukulim, which is like the ethic of responsibility, which is very central to a lot of Indigenous ways of knowing, sort of centralizes Indigenous ethics rather than like Western bioethics. So I don't know if that would be something to consider like moving forward or not, or if you agree with that.
I take it that this is part of my portion of the presentation, so I would imagine that. Yeah, Lid, if you have a follow-up to this, do you have a follow-up? Okay, so I suppose there's a couple of things. Maybe just help me understand. I want to make sure I understand you first before I go ahead and give an answer. What specifically do you see the tension in being? So for example, like, is it just the case that like bioethics is done from a distinctively Western kind of perspective, and that seems to like make the issue in some sense non-Indigenous, or like the approach is just like explicitly non-Indigenous or something like that? I'm sorry if I didn't catch your meaning.
No, it's fine. So yeah, I think just like labeling these issues as bioethical rather than like Indigenous ethics or things like that, because they seem to be two distinctively categories. Even in philosophy, like Western bioethics might have like a more like clinical research focus or focus on like health issues, whereas these issues are more sort of Indigenous in nature and follow Indigenous ethics and Indigenous sort of self-determination. And so more broadly fits under that umbrella.
Yeah, understood. So so there's a very specific sense in which I'm using the term bioethics, and thank you for highlighting this. This is something that wasn't explicit. I'm using a very much historicized concept of bioethics. So just very much in the sense of like moral reasoning applied to questions of human life and death in and outside of healthcare. And so in that sense, it very much leaves it open for an indigenous, like on that definition of bioethics, it's very consistent to call this an indigenous bioethical issue. Yeah, not as like a cop-out answer, but as like I'm using it in a certain way that leaves open the consistency between these.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
And if there's nothing else incredibly pressing, I might turn it back over to Court. I think we're about at time.
We are